July 25, 1945. 30,000 feet above Japan, Captain Robert Hanson sat in the cockpit of his B-29 Superfortress and watched his right engine transform into a massive fireball. The temperature inside the cabin skyrocketed to 120 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds. The acrid smell of burning fuel and melting metal invaded his lungs, making each breath feel like inhaling fire itself. He had exactly 90 seconds before the entire aircraft would explode into a million burning pieces. But that wasn't his biggest problem. Not even close. His real nightmare began 8 minutes later when his white parachute dropped him directly into the center of a Japanese village called Minamata. This wasn't just any village. Just 24 hours earlier, American bombers had devastated this community, killing 47 innocent civilians in a devastating raid. The wounds were still fresh, the anger still burning. 300 enraged villagers immediately surrounded the American pilot the moment his feet touched Japanese soil. They came armed with pitchforks, axes, bamboo spears, and ancient samurai swords passed down through generations. Their faces contorted with rage and grief. Their voices rose in a terrifying chorus of vengeance. Bob knew exactly what the Japanese military did to captured American airmen. The stories had circulated through every bomber base in the Pacific. Torture, beheading. Sometimes they kept pilots alive for days, extracting information through methods too horrific to describe in official reports. The Geneva Convention meant nothing here. American bomber crews were considered war criminals, not prisoners of war. He had lived exactly 24 years, 4 months and 13 days. Back home in Wisconsin, his fiancée Mary waited for his return. They had planned their wedding for October. She had already bought her dress. His mother had started preparing the reception hall. Now he knelt in the dirt of an enemy village, hands raised in surrender, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate him, every reason to want him dead. An elderly farmer, his face weathered by decades of working under the brutal sun, stepped forward from the crowd. In his gnarled hands, he gripped a rusty sickle, its blade dulled by years of cutting rice, but still sharp enough to kill. The old man raised the farming tool high above Bob's head. The crowd fell silent in anticipation. This was the moment, the end. And then something happened that defied every expectation, every prediction, every logical outcome. Something that would change not just Bob's life, but his entire understanding of war, humanity, and the thin line between enemy and friend. What happened in the next 60 seconds was impossible, illogical, completely contrary to everything the war had taught both sides. This story never made it into the history textbooks. Military historians overlooked it. Hollywood never made it into a movie. For decades, it remained buried in classified reports and fading memories. But it should be told, because what happened in that small Japanese village on July 25, 1945, reveals a truth that war tries desperately to hide. Even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion can triumph over hatred. Even between the bitterest enemies, understanding can bloom. Even when every instinct screams for revenge, mercy can prevail. This is that story. Robert James Hanson entered the world on March 12, 1921, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, a small industrial town nestled on the western shore of Lake Michigan. Nothing about his birth or early childhood suggested he would one day find himself at the center of one of World War II's most remarkable stories of survival and human compassion. His father, Thomas Hanson, worked as a skilled machinist at the Johnson Motors factory, earning a modest but steady wage that kept the family comfortable through the economic uncertainties of the 1920s and the devastating depression of the 1930s. His mother, Elizabeth, taught 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary School, instilling in young Bob a love of learning and a deep respect for education. The Hanson family embodied the American middle class. They owned their small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street. They attended St. Mary's Lutheran Church every Sunday morning. They celebrated holidays with extended family, gathering around tables laden with traditional Swedish dishes that connected them to their immigrant roots. Bob grew up as an entirely ordinary American boy. Average height for his age, sandy blonde hair that his mother kept neatly trimmed, blue eyes that squinted when he smiled, a smattering of freckles across his nose that darkened every summer. Nothing physically remarkable, nothing that made him stand out in school photographs or neighborhood baseball games. In school, he maintained a solid B average, not brilliant enough for academic honors, but far from struggling. He excelled in mathematics and mechanical drawing, showing an intuitive understanding of how things fit together, how structures bore weight, how forces distributed through complex systems. His teachers noted his quiet competence, his steady reliability, his tendency to help classmates who fell behind. But Bob truly came alive on the baseball diamond. Every afternoon after school, he could be found at Washington Park, playing pickup games that stretched until mothers called children home for dinner. He played second base with steady, unspectacular competence. Good hands, reliable arm, smart base runner, the kind of player every team needed, but scouts never noticed. His dreams centered on engineering. He spent hours sketching bridges, calculating load distributions, imagining the massive structures he would one day design. He talked about attending the University of Wisconsin, earning his engineering degree, maybe working for one of the big firms in Milwaukee or Chicago, building things, creating infrastructure that would last for generations, leaving a permanent mark on the landscape. The future stretched before him, clear and achievable: college, career, marriage to a girl from his hometown, children, a house with a white picket fence. The American dream in its purest, most attainable form. But history had different plans. Sunday, December 7th, 1941, began like any other weekend in the Hanson household. Bob woke late, enjoyed his mother's famous Swedish pancakes with lingering syrup, and spent the morning working on a model airplane in the basement workshop. The afternoon stretched ahead with pleasant emptiness. Maybe catch a movie downtown. Maybe visit his girlfriend Mary at the diner where she worked weekend shifts. At 1:30 p.m. Central Time, the family gathered in the living room for their traditional Sunday dinner. Elizabeth had prepared pot roast with potatoes and carrots. Thomas carved the meat while Bob set the table. The radio played soft background music from a Chicago station. Then the programming stopped. An announcer's voice, tight with barely controlled urgency, broke through the music. The Japanese Empire had launched a massive surprise attack on the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Hundreds of American sailors were dead. Multiple battleships sunk or burning. The Pacific Fleet devastated. America was at war. The dinner grew cold on the plates. Nobody ate. They sat frozen, listening to the fragmentary, often contradictory reports flooding in from Hawaii. The scale of the disaster slowly emerged through the static and confusion. The Arizona, the Oklahoma, the California, ship after ship, burning or sunk. Thomas Hanson, who had served in the army during the First World War and still carried shrapnel in his left leg from the Meuse-Argonne offensive, stood without a word and walked out to the back porch. He stood there for an hour, staring at nothing, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling slightly. He knew what this meant. He had seen war. He had watched friends die in French mud, and now his only son would face the same. Elizabeth cried quietly at the kitchen table, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking. She had prayed every night for 20 years that her son would never have to see war, that the Great War had truly been the war to end all wars, that her boy could grow up in peace. Bob sat motionless in the living room, listening to the reports. He felt something fundamental shift inside him. The comfortable future he had imagined, college, career, marriage, suburban stability, suddenly seemed naive and selfish. Men were dying. His country was under attack. Everything had changed. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, processing the new reality. By dawn, he had made his decision. Monday morning, December 8th, Bob waited outside the Milwaukee recruitment office before it opened. He wasn't alone. The line already stretched 3 blocks, hundreds of young men standing in the cold December air, breath clouding in front of their faces, eyes bright with anger and determination and barely suppressed fear. America was burning with righteous fury. The Japanese attack hadn't just killed sailors and sunk ships. It had wounded American pride, violated American security, shattered the comfortable illusion that the United States could remain isolated from the spreading global conflict. Young men poured into recruitment offices across the nation, eager to avenge Pearl Harbor, to defend democracy, to prove their courage and patriotism. Bob could have chosen the Army. The recruitment sergeant explained that ground forces offered the best survival odds. Most soldiers who went overseas returned home. Casualties existed, but they were survivable. The Army needed millions of men for the coming campaigns. He would probably end up in Europe, fighting Germans, facing a civilized enemy bound by international conventions regarding prisoners of war. He could have chosen the Navy. His father had served on destroyers during the Great War and returned without serious injury. Surface ships offered safety in numbers, heavy armor, multiple redundancies. Even if a ship was hit, most sailors escaped. The Navy painted their survival statistics in optimistic colors. But Bob chose the Army Air Forces, the most dangerous service in the entire American military. He couldn't fully explain why. Something about the sky called to him. Something about flying felt right in a way he couldn't articulate. Maybe it was the idea of being above the fighting, seeing the battlefield from a godlike perspective. Maybe it was the romance of aviation, the image of intrepid pilots in leather jackets performing heroic deeds. Maybe it was simply youthful invincibility, the conviction that nothing bad could happen to him personally. The statistics told a different, darker story. Training officers didn't hide the numbers. They couldn't. Word spread too quickly through the aviation training pipeline. In the European theater during 1943 and 1944, bomber crews faced approximately 40% casualty rates. 4 out of every 10 aircraft didn't return from missions over Germany. Some went down in flames, shot apart by flak or fighters. Some crashed on return, damaged beyond ability to land safely. Some simply vanished, lost over the North Sea or deep in German territory, crew fate unknown. The average operational life expectancy of a B-17 bomber crew over Germany in 1943 was 11 missions, just 11. Most crews were required to complete 25 missions before rotating home. The mathematics was simple and brutal. Most wouldn't make it. A pilot's chance of surviving a complete tour, 25 missions, stood at roughly 1 in 4. 25%. 3 out of every 4 pilots would be killed, severely wounded or captured before completing their required missions. Bob signed the papers without hesitation. The recruitment officer stamped his forms, handed him a packet of information and told him to report to Great Lakes Naval Station in 2 weeks for transport to flight training. When Bob returned home that evening and told his parents what he had done, his mother wept for 3 hours. She locked herself in her bedroom and sobbed into her pillow, knowing but unable to accept that she might never see her son again. His father took Bob out to the back porch. The 2 men stood in silence for several minutes, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder and squeezed once. His voice, when he spoke, was rough with suppressed emotion. He told Bob to come home, however he had to do it. Whatever it took. Come home. A soldier's life was precious beyond measure. Nothing, not duty, not honor, not victory, mattered more than survival. Bob promised he would come home, somehow. It was a promise he would barely keep. February 1942, Randolph Field, Texas, nicknamed the West Point of the Air. Bob and 147 other aviation cadets arrived on a cold morning, stepping off trains onto a sprawling military base that would either transform them into combat pilots or wash them out in failure. The instructors made the odds clear from day one. Approximately 40% of cadets would not complete training. Some would fail academic requirements, some would fail physical requirements. Some would wash out during flight training, unable to master the complex skills required to handle aircraft in combat conditions. And some would die. Training accidents killed dozens of cadets every month. Engine failures, mid-air collisions, navigational errors, weather, mechanical malfunctions. The aircraft they trained on, AT-6, Texans, BT-13 Valiants, PT-17 Stearmans, were unforgiving machines that punished mistakes instantly and often fatally. The training regimen was brutal by design. The Air Force needed to identify and eliminate unsuitable candidates quickly, before wasting expensive multi-engine training on men who couldn't handle the pressure. Cadets woke at 5 a.m. Physical training until 6:30. Breakfast until 7 day. Then classes from 7:30 a.m. until 6 p.m. with only a 30-minute lunch break. They studied aircraft recognition, meteorology, navigation, radio procedures, aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and military protocol. They memorized the silhouettes of hundreds of Allied and enemy aircraft, needing to identify them correctly in split-second recognition drills. They calculated wind drift corrections, magnetic variations, fuel consumption rates, and optimal cruise settings. They learned Morse code, memorizing the entire alphabet and common abbreviations until they could receive and transmit at 20 words per minute. And then, finally, they flew. Bob's first flight lasted 15 minutes. His instructor, Captain William Stevens, a combat veteran of the Battle of Britain with 11 confirmed kills, took him up in a PT-17 Stearman biplane. The open cockpit exposed them to the rushing wind and deafening engine roar. The plane shook and vibrated. The propeller blast made conversation impossible even through the intercom. Stevens demonstrated basic maneuvers: level flight, climbs, descents, turns. The aircraft responded to the slightest control inputs, sensitive and immediate in ways Bob had never experienced. The ground fell away beneath them, the airfield shrinking to miniature, the Texas landscape spreading to distant horizons in all directions. Something clicked inside Bob. Something fundamental and undeniable. He was born for this. Over the following 18 months, Bob accumulated 500 flight hours. He soloed after 9 hours of dual instruction, faster than average. He mastered aerobatic maneuvers, loops, rolls, spins, hammerheads, until they became second nature, executed without conscious thought. He learned instrument flying, trusting his gauges when his senses lied to him about orientation and altitude. He practiced formation flying, tucking his wingtip 6 feet from his lead's wingtip, holding position through turbulence and clouds and darkness. After primary training, he transitioned to basic trainers, more powerful aircraft with retractable landing gear and variable pitch propellers. After basic, he moved to advanced trainers, twin-engine aircraft that approximated the handling characteristics of combat bombers. Finally, he earned his silver pilot wings and second lieutenant's bars. But Captain Stevens pulled him aside after the graduation ceremony. He told Bob something that should have been a warning, a prophecy, a glimpse of the future. He said Bob possessed natural talent, the kind of instinctive flying ability that appeared in perhaps 1 in every 1,000 pilots. Stevens had seen 3 pilots with Bob's level of raw skill during his years as an instructor. 2 of them were already dead, killed in combat over Europe. Bob should have been scared. Instead, he just smiled and thanked his instructor for the compliment. Youth and skill make men feel invincible. Bob was about to learn how wrong that feeling could be. August 1943, Boeing's Wichita plant, Kansas. Bob saw the B-29 Superfortress for the first time and felt his confidence waver. The aircraft was enormous, dwarfing every other bomber he had trained on. It sat on the tarmac like a silver leviathan, almost impossibly large, more building than aircraft. The statistics were staggering. The B-29 measured 99 feet long with a 141-foot wingspan. Empty, it weighed 74,500 pounds. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and bombs, it could exceed 135,000 pounds. 4 massive Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, drove 4-bladed propellers 17 feet in diameter. The B-29 could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs to targets 1,500 miles away and return to base. It could fly at altitudes exceeding 33,000 feet, above the effective range of most anti-aircraft fire. It could cruise at 230 miles per hour and sprint at 357 miles per hour when necessary. It featured remote-controlled gun turrets, pressurized crew compartments, and the most advanced bomb sight ever installed in an aircraft. This was the most sophisticated, most expensive, most technologically advanced bomber ever built. Each aircraft cost $639,000, more than twice the cost of a B-17 Flying Fortress. The entire B-29 program consumed $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project would spend developing the atomic bomb. And it was also one of the most dangerous aircraft American pilots would ever fly. During 1943 and early 1944, the B-29 killed more American airmen in training accidents than in combat operations. The massive engines overheated constantly, sometimes catching fire in flight. The complex systems failed regularly. Hydraulic lines ruptured, electrical systems shorted. Landing gear refused to extend, controls froze. Engine fires were the primary killer. The R-3350 engines, pushed to their operational limits to provide the necessary power, ran extremely hot even in normal operations. Any malfunction, oil leak, fuel leak, ignition problem, could instantly transform an engine into a blowtorch. And engine fires in flight were nearly impossible to extinguish. The fire suppression system often failed. The fire would spread to the wing fuel tanks. Then the aircraft exploded. One instructor told Bob the B-29 was actively trying to kill its crew even before encountering the enemy. That wasn't entirely a joke. But this magnificent, deadly machine was America's best chance to bring the war directly to Japan's home islands. No other aircraft had the range to reach Japan from American bases. The B-29 made strategic bombing of Japan possible, and Bob was going to learn to master it or die trying. September 1943, the Air Force assigned Bob as aircraft commander of a B-29, designating him responsible for 11 lives beyond his own. Being selected as aircraft commander at age 22 was unusual. Most commanders were older, more experienced. But Bob's instructors had recognized his unusual competence, his natural leadership, his ability to stay calm under pressure. Now he needed to forge 11 individuals into a cohesive crew capable of surviving combat. His co-pilot, James O'Connor, was 24, a loud, gregarious Irishman from Boston's South End who had worked as an aircraft mechanic before the war. Jimmy knew engines intimately, could diagnose problems by sound alone, could coax extra performance from temperamental machinery. He was also the crew clown, constantly joking, never serious, using humor to diffuse tension and fear. David Cohen, the navigator, was 22, a quiet Jewish mathematics genius from Brooklyn who had been studying for his PhD at Columbia University when Pearl Harbor interrupted his academic career. He could calculate navigation solutions in his head, correcting for wind drift and magnetic variation without paper. He wore thick glasses, spoke softly, and carried a photograph of his wife Sarah and 4-year-old daughter Rebecca in his breast pocket. Thomas Rodriguez, the bombardier, was 23, a calm, methodical Mexican-American from El Paso who had worked in his father's surveying business. Before enlisting, Tom approached bombing with mathematical precision, accounting for altitude, airspeed, wind drift, target movement, and ballistic trajectory with meticulous care. He was the best bombardier in their training group, regularly placing practice bombs within 50 feet of designated targets from 30,000 feet altitude. Frank Miller, the flight engineer, was 29, the oldest crew member, a former Ford factory worker from Detroit who understood mechanical systems with instinctive clarity. Frank could repair almost anything with improvised tools and spare parts. His hands were perpetually stained with oil and grease. He rarely spoke, but missed nothing, constantly monitoring gauges and instruments, anticipating problems before they became critical. Robert Stone, called Rocky, the radio operator, was 20, the youngest crew member, a fast-talking Californian from San Diego who could send and receive Morse code at 40 words per minute. Rocky spoke constantly, narrating his thoughts, joking through the intercom, maintaining verbal contact with everyone. His nervous energy kept the crew alert during long flights. The 5 gunners, George Hartford, William Brown, Charles Johnson, Anthony Romano, Patrick Murphy, were all between 20 and 25. All from working-class backgrounds, all volunteers who had chosen the most dangerous positions on the aircraft. Gunners died first when fighters attacked. Gunners had the least protection from flak. Gunners' positions were exposed, vulnerable, offering minimal armor against enemy fire. These 11 men came from different backgrounds, different regions, different economic classes. Under normal circumstances, they would never have met, never have become friends, never have trusted each other. But war threw them together and demanded they function as a single organism, each member essential, each role critical. They named their aircraft Lucky Lady and painted the name on the nose, along with a cartoon figure of a woman riding a four-leaf clover. They believed the name would bring them luck, would protect them, would ensure they all returned home safely. They were naive. But then, most bomber crews were naive at the beginning. Experience burned away naivety quickly enough. The briefing room at Saipan Air Base fell silent when the operations officer pulled back the curtain covering the wall map. A red ribbon stretched from Saipan across 1,300 miles of Pacific Ocean to a point on the Japanese island of Honshu. Target, Mitsubishi Aircraft Works, Nagoya, one of Japan's largest aircraft manufacturing facilities, producing fighters and bombers that would kill American soldiers and sailors if allowed to operate. Expected enemy opposition, moderate to heavy fighter presence. Significant anti-aircraft artillery. Weather forecast, clear. Perfect bombing conditions. Takeoff, 0800 hours. Time over target, 1300 hours. Expected return, 1800 hours. Mission duration, 10 hours. Bob sat with his crew in the crowded briefing room, studying the target photographs, memorizing the approach route, noting landmarks and checkpoints. Around them, 46 other crews processed the same information, calculating the same risks, feeling the same mixture of determination and fear. At 0430 hours, Bob woke after 3 hours of fitful sleep. He forced himself to eat breakfast, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. Though his stomach rebelled against food, the mess hall was nearly silent. Crews ate mechanically, not tasting, just fueling their bodies for the mission ahead. At 0730, Bob and his crew walked to Lucky Lady. The pre-flight inspection took 30 minutes. Bob walked around the aircraft, checking for damage, leaks, loose panels. Frank crawled into the engine nacelles, examining oil levels, fuel lines, ignition systems. The gunners test-fired their weapons, sending short bursts into the dirt beyond the runway. At 0800, all 4 engines roared to life. The noise was deafening even through headphones. The aircraft shook and vibrated, metal stressing under the power of 8,800 horsepower. At 0815, Lucky Lady began her takeoff roll. Heavily loaded with fuel and bombs, she needed almost the entire 8,500-foot runway to achieve flying speed. The tail lifted, the main wheels left concrete. They were airborne. Bob retracted the landing gear and flaps, trimmed the aircraft for climb, and settled into formation with the other 46 B-29s forming up over the island. The formation looked beautiful and terrible, 47 massive bombers flying in precise echelon, thousands of tons of aircraft and explosives heading toward Japan with destructive purpose. The flight to Japan took 5 hours. Bob spent most of that time monitoring instruments, making small control corrections, watching for enemy fighters or mechanical problems. Around him, the crew stayed silent, each man absorbed in his own thoughts, his own fears, his own determination. At 12:45 hours, David announced they were 15 minutes from the target. Bob ordered the crew to battle stations. Gunners charged their weapons. Tom activated the bomb sight. Frank monitored engine instruments with increased vigilance. At 12:55, the formation crossed the Japanese coast. Below them, Honshu looked peaceful, almost pastoral. Green fields, small villages, winding roads. Mountains in the distance. It was hard to believe this was enemy territory, that people down there wanted to kill them, that they were about to rain death on that landscape. At 1300, everything exploded into chaos. 6 Japanese A6M0 fighters dove from above, their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns flashing. Tracer rounds drew red and green lines across the sky. The sound of the Lucky Lady's defensive guns firing was deafening even through headphones and the pressurized cabin. 10 flashed past Bob's windscreen so close he could see the pilot's face. Young. Probably younger than Bob. Eyes wide with concentration, mouth set in determination. For one fractional second, the 2 pilots made eye contact. Then the 0 was gone, diving away. 50 feet to the right, a B-29 named Thunderbolt took multiple 20mm cannon hits in the left wing. The wing folded upward, structural spars failing under the explosive impacts. The bomber pitched into a violent spin, centrifugal forces preventing the crew from reaching the escape hatches. Bob watched 3 men successfully bail out, their parachutes blossoming white against the blue sky. Thunderbolt exploded when it hit 15,000 feet, the bomb load detonating in a massive orange fireball that consumed the aircraft, and the 8 crew members still trapped inside. 11 men Bob had eaten breakfast with that morning. 11 men who had joked and complained and expressed the same hopes and fears. 8 of them died in approximately 4 seconds. 3 would be captured, tortured, and eventually executed by the Japanese military police. Bob had no time to process what he had just witnessed. Anti-aircraft fire began bursting around the formation, black flowers of explosive fury blooming in precisely calculated kill zones. Shrapnel rattled against Lucky Lady's fuselage like deadly hail. One burst exploded close enough to rock the aircraft sideways. Tom's voice came through the intercom, calm and measured, despite the chaos. Bomb bay doors open. Target acquired. Bomb run beginning. Bob held the aircraft level and steady, despite every instinct screaming to jink and weave to avoid the flak. The bombardier needed stability for accuracy, so Bob held steady, fingers white-knuckled on the controls, while explosive shells tried to tear his aircraft apart. 10 seconds to bomb release. 5 seconds. Bombs away. 20,000 pounds of high explosive and incendiary bombs dropped toward the Mitsubishi factory. Lucky Lady lurched upward, suddenly 9 tons lighter. Bob immediately threw the aircraft into a hard bank. Breaking from the bombing formation, getting away from the killing zone as fast as the massive bomber could fly. Behind them, the factory erupted in flames. Secondary explosions rippled across the facility as bombs hit machine shops, warehouses, and fuel storage tanks. Mission successful, target destroyed. But the cost was horrific. Of the 47 B-29s that attacked Nagoya that day, only 44 returned to Saipan. 3 aircraft, 33 men lost. Lucky Lady touched down with 47 holes in her fuselage and wings. 7 of those holes were within 6 feet of where Bob sat. If any of those shells had exploded 6 feet to the right, Bob would have died. The crew didn't celebrate their survival. They stood under the aircraft, staring at the damage, processing the reality that they had to do this 24 more times before completing their tour. This was mission number 1. Between December 1943 and July 1945, the Lucky Lady crew flew 23 more combat missions: Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kawasaki, city after city. Each mission lasting 8 to 12 hours, each mission risking everything. The original formation of 47 B-29s that flew that first Nagoya mission gradually diminished. Aircraft were shot down. Aircraft crashed on return, too damaged to land safely. Aircraft disappeared over the ocean, fate unknown. Replacement crews arrived, flew a few missions, then disappeared themselves. By July 1945, only 19 of the original 47 aircraft remained operational. 28 aircraft, 308 men, lost to enemy action or mechanical failure. Some crews were lucky. They bailed out over the ocean and were rescued by American submarines. Some were captured and became prisoners of war. But most simply died, their aircraft exploding in mid-air or crashing into Japanese soil with no survivors. The missions themselves evolved. The initial strategy of precision daylight bombing against specific military and industrial targets proved ineffective. Japanese industry was decentralized, scattered among thousands of small workshops embedded within residential neighborhoods. Bombing a single factory accomplished little when component parts were manufactured in hundreds of locations across the city. In March 1945, General Curtis LeMay, the aggressive, ruthless commander of the XTX Bomber Command, made a decision that fundamentally changed the nature of the air war against Japan. He ordered a switch to area bombing using incendiary weapons designed to start massive firestorms in Japanese cities. The reasoning was brutally pragmatic. Japanese cities were uniquely vulnerable to fire. Over 90% of residential structures were built primarily from wood, bamboo, and paper. Houses sat closely packed in dense neighborhoods, with narrow streets that would impede firefighting efforts. A single incendiary cluster could ignite dozens of buildings. Hundreds of clusters could destroy entire city districts. The M69 incendiary bomb became the primary weapon. Each bomb contained thermite and white phosphorus compounds that burned at 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Water couldn't extinguish thermite fires. Attempts to douse the flames with water actually made them burn hotter and spread faster. The bombs were designed to penetrate roofs before igniting, starting fires inside buildings where they would be hardest to fight. The night of March 9th of 1945, marked the culmination of this new strategy. Operation Meeting House targeted Tokyo with 334 B-29 bombers carrying 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs. The attack began just after midnight, aircraft flying at low altitude to maximize accuracy and bomb loads. Lucky Lady participated in this mission. Bob would remember it for the rest of his life as the night he lost a piece of his soul. The bombing created a firestorm that exceeded the worst predictions. The incendiaries started so many fires so quickly that they created their own weather system. Superheated air rose rapidly, drawing in cooler air from the surroundings. Wind speeds at ground level reached 60-70 miles per hour, fanning the flames higher and spreading fires faster than anyone could flee. Temperature at street level exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Human bodies didn't just burn at those temperatures, they literally vaporized, reduced to ash and shadows. Asphalt melted into bubbling tar pits that trapped fleeing civilians. Glass windows flowed like water. Metal structures softened and collapsed. The firestorm generated a tornado of flame that reached 1,000 feet into the air. The swirling vortex of superheated wind pulled people, vehicles, debris into its burning center. Some civilians tried to escape by jumping into the Sumida River. The water boiled. They cooked alive. Even at 7,000 feet altitude, B-29 crews could smell burning flesh. The stench penetrated the pressurized cabins, invaded their nostrils and mouths, coated their throats. Some crews vomited in their oxygen masks. Some wept openly. All were traumatized by what they witnessed. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo had ceased to exist. Over 100,000 people were dead, most of them civilians. More people died in that single night than would die in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima 4 months later. Bob flew Lucky Lady through that inferno, released his load of incendiary bombs, added to the destruction. He watched the city burn. He smelled the death. He knew that among those 100,000 dead were children, elderly, women, people who had nothing to do with military decisions, who simply had the misfortune of being born in the wrong country at the wrong time. Something broke inside him that night, something that would never fully heal. The moral weight of fire bombing campaigns crushed the Lucky Lady crew's collective psyche. They had enlisted to fight military targets. They had trained to attack factories, refineries, military bases. They accepted the necessity of war, the requirement to destroy the enemy's capacity to make war. But burning civilians alive felt different, wrong, criminal, even as they understood the strategic reasoning. Jimmy O'Connor, the jovial Irish co-pilot, started drinking heavily after the Tokyo firestorm. He would show up for morning briefings hungover, hands shaking, breath smelling of cheap whiskey purchased from shady dealers near the base. Bob confronted him multiple times, threatened to ground him, warned him about alcohol's effect on reflexes and judgment at altitude. Jimmy's response was always the same. Sober, he saw their faces. The burning children, the screaming mothers, the old men trying to beat out flames consuming their bodies. Drunk, the images blurred, became bearable. He needed the alcohol to function, to climb into the aircraft each mission, to drop more fire on more civilians. David Cohen withdrew into himself. The gregarious mathematician who had entertained the crew with stories and jokes became silent, speaking only when absolutely necessary for mission completion. He checked his navigation calculations 10 times, 20 times, obsessed with accuracy, terrified that an error would cause additional deaths beyond those already planned. The photograph of his wife and daughter that he used to show proudly to anyone who would look remained hidden in his pocket. He couldn't bear looking at his daughter's smiling face while knowing he was incinerating other people's daughters. The cognitive dissonance was destroying him. Tom Rodriguez became mechanical, emotionless. He approached each mission like a factory worker on an assembly line. Take off, fly to target, release bombs, return to base, sleep, repeat. He stopped participating in crew conversations, stopped writing letters home, stopped caring about anything except the immediate technical requirements of his position. This psychological shutdown was his survival mechanism. If he didn't feel anything, he couldn't be hurt by what he was doing. Trauma couldn't touch him if he refused to acknowledge trauma existed. The gunners saw everything most clearly. They sat in exposed positions with panoramic views of the destruction below. They watched cities burn. They watched people flee through flaming streets. They watched the firestorms consume entire neighborhoods in minutes. They had front-row seats to mechanized mass death. Charles Johnson, the tail gunner who had shot down 7 enemy aircraft, never celebrated his kills. Each destroyed Japanese fighter represented a dead pilot. Another young man who probably had parents, maybe a wife, maybe children. Someone who was following orders just like Charles was following orders. The only difference between them was the flag they served. Charles began asking himself uncomfortable questions. If he had been born in Japan instead of Alabama, would he be the one dying? Were Japanese pilots evil, or were they simply doing their job? What was the difference between a Japanese pilot dropping bombs on American facilities and an American pilot dropping bombs on Japanese cities? The questions had no good answers, so Charles stopped asking and focused on surviving mission to mission. July 20th, 1945. Mission 24 for the Lucky Lady crew. One more after this, then they would complete their tour and return home. 25 missions. The magic number that meant survival, rotation stateside, life after war. The target was Utsunomiya, a city 60 miles north of Tokyo, home to an important railway junction and military supply depot. Intelligence reports indicated light defenses. Most Japanese fighters had been pulled back to defend the home islands from the expected American invasion. Anti-aircraft guns were old, poorly maintained, and inadequately supplied with ammunition. The briefing officer described it as a routine mission. Low risk, minimal opposition, perfect conditions for Mission 24. Get in, drop bombs, get out, come home. Bob didn't believe in routine missions. Every mission was dangerous, every mission risked everything. 23 times they had flown to Japan and returned safely. That didn't guarantee a 24th safe return. Survival was never guaranteed. The morning pre-flight revealed that engine number 4, the farthest outboard on the right wing, was still experiencing cooling problems from their previous mission. The mechanics had worked on it, replacing hoses and adjusting baffles, but the engine ran hotter than specifications allowed. Frank strongly recommended delaying the mission until they could replace the entire engine, but the squadron commander denied the request. All available aircraft needed to participate in the strike. Lucky Lady was marginally airworthy. She would fly. Bob accepted the decision but felt uneasy. Something about this mission felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. Instinct whispered warnings. His stomach churned with anxiety unrelated to normal pre-mission nerves. He ignored the warning signs. He was a soldier. He followed orders, and they only had 2 missions left. The takeoff and flight to Japan proceeded normally. Engine number 4 ran hot, but stayed within acceptable operating limits. The formation of 35 B-29s maintained tight discipline, flying through beautiful weather, blue skies stretching to every horizon. Jimmy made a joke, his first in weeks. He said maybe the Japanese had already surrendered, and nobody had bothered to tell the bomber crews. Everyone laughed, more from relief than humor. The laughter felt good. Normal. Human. They crossed the Japanese coast at 1330 hours. Still no enemy fighters, no anti-aircraft fire. The cities below looked peaceful, almost idyllic in the afternoon sunlight. At 1343 hours, with the target 10 miles ahead and bomb bay doors open, 20 Japanese Ki-84 Hayate fighters attacked from below, emerging from positions underneath the formation where radar coverage was weakest. The ambush was perfectly executed. The fighters had been waiting, probably vectored into position by ground-based radar installations, hiding at lower altitude until the B-29s were committed to their bombing run and unable to maneuver aggressively. 20mm cannons and 12.7mm machine guns tore into the formation. Lucky Lady shuddered as cannon shells ripped through the right wing, between engines 3 and 4, punching through aluminum skin, severing fuel lines, shredding control cables. Engine 3 burst into flames immediately. Engine 4 began overheating rapidly, temperature gauges climbing into the red zone within seconds. Frank activated the fire suppression system. Nothing happened. The system had been damaged in the initial attack. He grabbed a portable extinguisher and fought his way back through the aircraft toward the burning engine. Foam sprayed over the nacelle, temporarily suppressing the flames. But fuel was still leaking, and fuel feeding an existing fire meant the flames would return. Jimmy shut down fuel flow to engines 3 and 4. The propellers windmilled to a stop. Lucky Lady lost power from 2 of her 4 engines. More fighters attacked. More cannon shells punched through the fuselage. The hydraulic system failed. The bomb bay doors jammed half open. The electrical system began fluctuating wildly. Bob jettisoned the bombs without targeting, letting 9 tons of explosives fall randomly over the Japanese countryside. The aircraft needed to be lighter, needed to be faster, needed to survive. Engine 4's temperature continued climbing. The warning light flashed red. The metal cowling began glowing cherry red, heated beyond tolerance by internal fires the extinguisher hadn't fully suppressed. Frank delivered the news Bob already knew. The fuel tank in the right wing would explode within 2 minutes, 3 at most. Once fire breached the tank, containing 1,100 gallons of aviation gasoline, the explosion would tear the wing off. Bob made the hardest decision of his life in less than 1 second. He ordered the crew to bail out. Abandon aircraft, jump now or burn alive. The emergency bailout bell rang 3 times, the signal every bomber crew dreaded. Abandon aircraft, every man for himself. Jump and pray. Organized evacuation procedures evaporated. Training scenarios assumed crews would have minutes to prepare. They had seconds. David, Tom, and Rocky scrambled toward the forward escape hatch in the nose section. They tore off their headsets, grabbed parachute packs, and dove through the opening in rapid succession. Their bodies tumbled into the slipstream at 280 miles per hour, spinning violently before stabilizing. The 5 gunners exited through their respective positions. Romano and Murphy through sideways hatches. Hartford through the top turret opening. Brown through the bottom turret access. Johnson through the tail gunner position. All 5 men plummeted into the void within 15 seconds. Frank paused only to grab the emergency survival pack containing first aid supplies, flares, and a small emergency radio. He dove through the nose hatch and disappeared. Jimmy remained frozen in the co-pilot's seat. Bob glanced over and saw his co-pilot trembling, eyes wide with panic, hands gripping his seat armrests white-knuckled. Jimmy was experiencing an acute phobic response. The rational part of his brain understood he needed to jump. The primitive part, the part controlling his muscles, refused to obey. Bob had no time for gentle persuasion. He unstrapped, crossed to Jimmy's seat, released his co-pilot's restraints, physically hauled the larger man out of the seat, and dragged him toward the nose hatch. Jimmy resisted, fighting against Bob, pleading incoherently. Bob understood. Jimmy's fear of heights was being triggered in the most extreme way possible. He was being asked to voluntarily fall 28,000 feet. Bob did the only thing that might work. He shoved Jimmy through the hatch. Jimmy's scream cut off as the slipstream caught him and flung him away from the aircraft. His parachute deployed 3 seconds later, automatic activation, working as designed. He was safe, relatively. Bob grabbed his own chest pack parachute, clipped it to his harness, and took one last look around Lucky Lady's cockpit. This aircraft had carried him through 24 combat missions, 300 hours of flight time. This cabin had been his office, his sanctuary, his second home for 18 months. He knew every switch, every gauge, every quirk of her personality. Now she was dying. Flames crawled across the right wing. Metal skin warped and buckled from internal heat. Seconds remained until catastrophic structural failure. Bob whispered an apology to the aircraft he loved and jumped into space. The sensation of freefall defied description. Bob plummeted at 120 miles per hour, wind roaring past his head, the world spinning dizzyingly. Centrifugal forces made his limbs heavy. His stomach lurched into his throat. Adrenaline dumped into his bloodstream, sharpening his senses to painful clarity. He counted to 5, letting himself fall away from the disintegrating aircraft, then pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployment was violent. The canopy snapped open with explosive force, arresting his freefall in less than 1 second. The harness straps bit into his shoulders and thighs with bruising impact. His helmet was nearly torn off by the deceleration, but the parachute worked. The white canopy filled with air, spreading above him, lowering him toward Earth at a manageable 15 feet per second. Silence enveloped him. After hours of deafening engine noise, the sudden quiet felt unnatural. He could hear wind rustling the parachute shroud lines, hear his own breathing, fast and shallow with adrenaline. He looked up and saw Lucky Lady 5,000 feet above him, wings trailing black smoke, nose pointed down in an uncontrolled dive. The aircraft dropped through 15,000 feet, then 10,000, then 7,000. At 6,000 feet, Lucky Lady exploded. 20,000 pounds of remaining bombs detonated simultaneously. 9,000 gallons of remaining aviation fuel added to the fireball. The explosion was massive, beautiful, terrible. An orange sphere of fire 500 feet in diameter, expanding outward in microseconds. Debris spread across a mile of sky, burning fragments tumbling toward Earth. The shockwave hit Bob 10 seconds later, a wall of compressed air that set his parachute swinging wildly. He gripped the risers, fighting to stabilize his descent. Below him, scattered across several miles of airspace, he counted 10 other parachutes, 11 total, including his own. Every member of his crew had escaped Lucky Lady before she exploded. Against all odds, all 11 men had survived the bailout. But surviving the bailout wasn't the same as surviving the war. Bob descended through 12,000 feet, then 9,000, then 6,000. The ground resolved into detailed clarity. He could see individual buildings now, roads, fields, people. Tiny figures stopped their activities and pointed upward, spotted the parachutes, knew what they meant. American airmen, the enemy, demons from the sky who had burned their cities. Bob could see he was descending toward a village, small, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 residents. Traditional Japanese architecture, tile roofs, narrow streets, a central square, and in that square people were gathering, dozens, then hundreds, looking upward. Watching him fall slowly toward them, he understood what was about to happen. These villagers had no reason to show mercy. Their government had told them American bomber crews were war criminals, that they murdered women and children deliberately, that they should be killed on sight. Bob couldn't steer a parachute. He was entirely at the mercy of wind and gravity. He would land wherever the wind carried him, right into the center of that increasingly hostile crowd. At 1,000 feet he saw their faces, anger, hatred. Some people carried farm implements that could serve as weapons. Pitchforks, scythes, axes, hoes with sharpened blades. At 500 feet he heard them shouting. Couldn't understand the Japanese words, but the tone was unmistakable. They wanted blood. They wanted revenge for what American bombers had done to their country. At 300 feet, Bob's military survival training tried to surface. He was supposed to try to avoid capture, evade, hide, make his way to the coast, signal for submarine pickup, standard escape and evasion protocols. But looking at the situation rationally, escape was impossible. He was landing in the middle of a village in broad daylight, surrounded by hundreds of civilians with no weapons, no supplies, no knowledge of the terrain or language. He was about to become a prisoner of war, or more likely, he was about to die. At 100 feet, time seemed to slow. Bob's life didn't flash before his eyes like in movies. Instead, he thought of very specific, small things. The smell of his mother's Swedish pancakes, the sound of Mary's laugh, the feel of cool Wisconsin lake water on a hot summer day. Baseball games at Washington Park, his father's workshop. The bridge design sketches he would never complete. 23 missions survived, 24 total. They had been so close to finishing their tour. One more mission. Just one more, and they would have gone home. At 50 feet, Bob braced for impact. At 10 feet, the crowd surged forward, reaching for him. He hit the ground. Bob's landing was harder than trained for, his knees buckling under the impact, his body rolling sideways. The parachute canopy collapsed over him, shrouding him in white silk. He became tangled in shroud lines, struggling to free himself, to see, to breathe. Hands grabbed him through the fabric, dozens of hands, pulling, tearing, lifting him roughly. Someone yanked the parachute away. Bob found himself on his knees in the dirt, surrounded by what appeared to be the entire population of the village. 300 faces staring at him with raw hatred. He slowly raised his hands above his head, the universal gesture of surrender. His survival training had emphasized this moment. Make yourself non-threatening. Show you're not resisting. Give them no excuse to shoot you. The shouting intensified. Bob couldn't understand the Japanese words, but their meaning penetrated clearly. Murderer, killer, demon. The crowd pressed closer, the circle tightening. A young man, perhaps 25 years old, pushed through the crowd. He carried a woodcutter's axe, the blade worn but sharp. Tears streamed down his face. He raised the axe above his head and screamed something in Japanese that sounded like an accusation, a condemnation. Bob understood he was about to die. This was the end. He closed his eyes and thought of Mary. Whispered her name. Apologized for not coming home as promised. The axe began its downward arc and stopped. Bob opened his eyes. An elderly man had caught the young man's wrist, holding the axe frozen in mid-air. The old man was small, thin, bent with age. He wore a simple grey kimono. His face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of outdoor work, but his eyes were clear, sharp, penetrating. The old man spoke quietly to the young man with the axe. Bob couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Authority. Command. The weight of respected age and position. The young man lowered the axe, stepped back. His face showed anguish, grief, rage, but also obedience. He deferred to the old man's decision. The crowd murmured, dissatisfied but accepting. Nobody challenged the old man. His authority appeared absolute. The old man looked at Bob for a long moment, studying him, evaluating. His expression was unreadable, neither hostile nor sympathetic, just observant. Finally, the old man nodded to two younger men in the crowd. They stepped forward, grabbed Bob's arms, hauled him to his feet. One produced a rough hemp rope and bound Bob's wrists behind his back, pulling the rope painfully tight, cutting into skin. The old man said something brief. The two men began dragging Bob away from the central square. The crowd parted to let them through, but followed, shouting abuse, spitting at Bob, throwing small stones that struck his shoulders and back. Someone's thrown stone hit his head, opening a small cut above his left eyebrow. Blood trickled into his eye. Bob didn't cry out, didn't react, just endured. They brought him to a small wooden structure on the village outskirts, a storage building of some kind, used for grain or equipment. The door was solid wood with a sturdy crossbar. No windows except small gaps between wall boards. The two men shoved Bob inside. He stumbled, fell to his knees on the hard-packed dirt floor. The door slammed shut. He heard the crossbar drop into place, locking him inside. Darkness, nearly absolute, only thin slivers of light penetrating between the wallboards. Bob was alone. On enemy territory, a prisoner. Most likely a dead man, waiting for execution. Bob had no way to measure time in the darkness of his prison, no watch. No light, nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the gradual numbing of his bound wrists. He tried to estimate how long he had been there. An hour? 2. His sense of time was completely distorted by darkness and stress. Eventually he heard voices outside. The crossbar lifted. The door opened. Afternoon sunlight flooded in, temporarily blinding him. Silhouettes against the bright doorway. Someone was thrown inside, landing hard beside Bob. The door closed immediately. Bob's eyes adjusted slowly. The new prisoner was Jimmy O'Connor. His co-pilot looked terrible. One eye was swollen shut, purple and blue with bruising. His lip was split, still bleeding. His flight suit was torn and dirty. But he was alive. Jimmy's good eye focused on Bob and widened with recognition. Both men felt overwhelming relief. They weren't alone. At least two of them had survived. Over the next several hours, the rest of the crew arrived, deposited one at a time into the storage building prison. David, Tom, Frank, Rocky, the 5 gunners, 11 men, all alive, all captured, all beaten to varying degrees, but all functional. Against incredible odds, the entire Lucky Lady crew had survived not just the bailout, but also the landing in enemy territory. Some had landed in fields and been captured by farmers. Some had landed in forests and been caught by village search parties. But all had been brought to this village, imprisoned together. Frank revealed he still had the emergency radio hidden in his flight suit. The guards who searched him had missed it, secured in an inside pocket. The radio was small, battery-powered, with a range of perhaps 20 miles, designed for signaling rescue submarines that patrolled near the Japanese coast. Hope flickered. Small, fragile, but real. If a submarine was within range, they might transmit their location. If the submarine received the signal, they might attempt a rescue. If. Too many conditions, too many unknowns. But it was something. As night fell, they huddled together in the darkness, 11 men who had become family over 18 months of training and combat. They didn't speak much. What was there to say? Their situation was desperate, their chances of survival minimal. But they were together. And as long as they remained alive, possibility existed. Morning came too quickly. The door opened. 4 Japanese soldiers entered, young men in military uniforms, carrying rifles with fixed bayonets. Behind them, an officer, a lieutenant, judging by his insignia. The officer spoke in broken English, clearly learned from a textbook rather than practice. He informed the crew they were accused of war crimes, of murdering civilians, of bombing non-military targets. Under Japanese military law, such crimes warranted summary execution. However, the village elder had requested a formal trial. The officer seemed annoyed by this deviation from normal procedure. War criminals should be executed immediately. But the elder was respected. Traditional Japanese culture gave elders absolute authority in village matters. The trial would occur this morning in the village square. The entire community would attend. The verdict was predetermined, guilty, but proper procedure would be followed. The soldiers forced the crew to their feet and marched them out of the storage building. The morning sun was painfully bright after hours in darkness. Bob blinked, eyes watering, gradually adjusting. The central square was packed with villagers, several hundred people. Every resident had gathered to witness the trial, to see justice done. To watch the American murderers receive their punishment. A wooden platform had been constructed overnight. 5 chairs sat behind a table. 5 village elders, the men who would judge them. In the center chair sat the same old man who had stopped the axe attack yesterday. The soldiers forced the crew to kneel in a row before the platform. The dirt was hard beneath Bob's knees. His bound wrists ached. Blood flow to his hands had been restricted for so long they had gone numb hours ago. The old man stood. He began speaking in Japanese. His voice was strong despite his age, carrying across the silent crowd. He spoke for several minutes without pause. Bob couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. This was the indictment, the list of crimes, the explanation of why the Americans deserved death. When the old man finished, he sat. The lieutenant stepped forward to translate, though his English was barely adequate. The crew was accused of bombing Japanese cities, of killing civilians, including women, children, and elderly, of destroying homes, schools, hospitals, of committing war crimes that violated all laws of civilized warfare. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. The crew had admitted to being bomber crew members. Their aircraft had been shot down over Japan. They were clearly guilty of all charges. The sentence was death by beheading, to be carried out immediately. 2 Japanese soldiers stepped forward from positions behind the kneeling Americans. Each carried a katana, a traditional samurai sword. Long, slightly curved blades that had been used for centuries for exactly this purpose. Execution of criminals and prisoners. The crowd fell silent. Anticipation, justice about to be served. The soldier behind Bob raised his sword, positioning the blade above Bob's neck. Bob closed his eyes. He thought of Mary, of his parents, of his unfinished life. 24 years old, so young. So much he would never experience. The sword held position, raised, ready to fall, and then the impossible happened. The old man stood and shouted a single word, a command. Wait. The old man descended from the platform slowly, each step measured and deliberate. Every eye in the village square followed his movement. The crowd held its collective breath. He approached Bob directly, ignoring the other 10 prisoners. He stopped directly in front of where Bob knelt, so close Bob could see every wrinkle, every age spot, every detail of the old man's weathered face. The old man reached out and touched Bob's face with one hand. The gesture was gentle, almost tender, completely unexpected. Bob felt calloused fingers, rough from decades of farm work, trace along his cheekbone. The old man spoke in Japanese. The lieutenant translated haltingly. The old man observed that Bob was young, very young. Just a boy, really, despite his uniform and military rank. The old man wanted to know if Bob had family waiting for him at home. Parents, perhaps a wife or sweetheart. Bob nodded, whispered his confirmation. Yes. Family, people who loved him, people who waited for his return. The old man nodded sadly. He understood. And then he revealed something that explained everything. The old man had also had a son, a pilot. Like Bob, his son had flown fighters for the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had died a year ago, shot down during the battle for the Philippines. American fighters had killed him. The old man had received notification of his son's death in a telegram. No body recovered, no grave to visit, just a telegram and eternal absence. The old man could see his son in Bob's face, the same youth, the same determination, the same dedication to duty and country. His son had been a good person, he said. Kind, honorable, brave, not a monster despite wearing a military uniform and killing enemies. War transformed good people into killers, not because they were evil, but because war demanded it. His son had killed Americans. Bob had killed Japanese. Neither was inherently evil. Both were simply following orders, doing their duty, serving their nations. The old man understood this truth that the war tried to obscure. Enemies were still human beings, still people with families, hopes, dreams, love. Killing them might be necessary for victory, but it shouldn't diminish their humanity. And if his son deserved to be remembered as a good person despite killing, then Bob deserved the same consideration. Justice demanded that Bob die for his crimes. But justice wasn't the only value. Mercy also mattered. Compassion also mattered. Humanity also mattered. The old man turned to face the crowd. He began speaking again, his voice rising with passion, echoing across the square. He talked about his son, about the telegram, about the grief that would never heal, about wanting revenge against Americans for taking his beloved child. But he also talked about the futility of endless revenge. If he killed Bob, would that bring his son back? No. If Bob died, Bob's mother would receive a similar telegram. She would feel the same grief, the same permanent wound. Killing Bob wouldn't end the pain. It would just spread the pain. Create more mothers who cried for dead sons. More families destroyed by war's appetite for young men. His son had died because someone decided he was the enemy, because someone reduced him to a uniform and a flag rather than seeing the human being beneath. If the old man now reduced Bob to just an enemy uniform, he would be perpetuating the same dehumanization that killed his son. War required killing, but it didn't require losing one's humanity. It didn't require forgetting that enemies were people. It didn't require choosing hatred over mercy when mercy was possible. The crowd listened, initially with resistance, then with gradually softening expressions. Some people cried. The young man who had tried to kill Bob with an axe lowered his head, shoulders shaking with sobs. The old man announced his decision. The Americans would not be executed. They would be held as prisoners until the war ended, then handed over to American forces alive and unharmed. This was his decree as village elder. This was his choice. Some in the crowd objected. Voices rose in protest. These men were murderers. They deserved death. Justice demanded it. The old man raised his hand, and silence fell immediately. His authority was absolute. He had made his decision. It would be respected. The soldiers lowered their swords, stepped back. The execution was cancelled. 11 American airmen, who moments ago had been seconds from death, remained alive, reprieved by an act of mercy from a man who had every reason to hate them. Bob felt tears streaming down his face. He couldn't stop them, couldn't control the overwhelming surge of emotion. Relief, gratitude, shame, wonder, all mixing together. The old man looked at Bob one more time and nodded slowly. Then he turned and walked back to the platform. The trial was over, the verdict reversed. Against all probability, compassion had triumphed over vengeance. The village moved the American prisoners to a small house on the outskirts. 2 rooms, basic furnishings, 2 guards stationed outside 24 hours per day, rotating in 6-hour shifts. But the treatment was remarkably humane. The guards removed their wristbands, provided water for washing, brought food 3 times per day: rice, fish, pickled vegetables, sometimes fruit. Simple fare, but sufficient. Better than many Japanese civilians were eating in July 1945 as the American submarine blockade strangled supply lines. A village doctor examined their injuries. He spoke no English, communicated through gestures and expressions. He cleaned and bandaged their wounds, set Jimmy's broken finger, applied ointment to burns and abrasions, provided pain medication. This treatment confused the crew. They had expected torture, starvation, the horrific conditions described in intelligence briefings about Japanese prisoner of war camps. Some American prisoners had been beheaded, some worked to death, some starved, some subjected to medical experiments. But this village was treating them almost as guests, protected, fed, cared for. Why? The answer became clear when the old man began visiting them daily. He came each afternoon, usually around 4 a.m. Sometimes he brought tea and rice crackers, sometimes books, though the books were in Japanese and useless to Americans who couldn't read the characters. Sometimes he just sat with them in silence, presence more important than conversation. The lieutenant served as translator during these visits. Through this awkward intermediary, Bob slowly learned about the old man's life. His name was Tanaka Hiroshi. He was 74 years old. He had been village elder for 23 years, inheriting the position from his father. He had farmed rice his entire life, the same fields his ancestors had worked for centuries. He had married at 20, fathered 3 children, 2 daughters who married and moved away, 1 son. His son, Tanaka Kenji, had been his pride. Smart, brave, dedicated. He had attended military flight school in Tokyo. Trained on Zeros, deployed to the Pacific in 1943. He had written letters home describing the beauty of flying, the honor of serving his emperor, the camaraderie of his squadron. Then the letters stopped. The telegram arrived. His son's aircraft had been shot down over Leyte Gulf in the Philippines during the massive naval battle in October 1944. American carrier fighters swarmed his squadron. 23 Japanese aircraft entered the engagement. 6 returned. Kenji's plane went down in flames. Tanaka described receiving the telegram, how his hands shook so violently he could barely read the characters, how his wife collapsed, screaming, how the neighbors came, offering condolences that meant nothing, how the world lost color and meaning. For months he wanted revenge, wanted to kill Americans, any Americans, all Americans. The hatred consumed him, but gradually understanding emerged from the hatred. His son had killed Americans before Americans killed him. Probably dozens. Fighter pilots racked up scores. If American families were grieving their dead sons killed by Kenji, how was Tanaka's grief any different? How was his son's killing morally superior to American killing? War was the evil, not the individual soldiers trapped in its machinery. His son wasn't evil for fighting. American pilots weren't evil for fighting. They were all victims of decisions made by old men in government buildings far from battlefields. And if Tanaka killed Bob, He would become what he hated. He would reduce himself to the level of senseless revenge, perpetuating the cycle of violence that consumed his son. So he chose mercy, not because Bob deserved mercy, not because Americans deserved mercy, but because Tanaka needed mercy for his own soul. He needed to prove to himself that humanity could survive even in war's darkest hours. Bob listened to this explanation through the halting translation and understood he was witnessing something extraordinary. This old farmer who had lost everything was teaching him a lesson about human nature that no military training had addressed. Enemies could be human, humans could transcend hatred. Mercy could exist even when justice screamed for blood. August 6, 1945. The lieutenant burst into the prisoner's house at noon, his face white with shock, his hands trembling. He spoke rapidly in Japanese, his voice cracking with emotion. Something had happened, something unprecedented, something that changed everything. Through fragmentary translation, the Americans gradually understood. A single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima, an entire city gone, vaporized in an instant. Casualties estimated at 100,000 or more, though accurate counts were impossible because entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. One bomb, not hundreds of bombs, not a massive raid, one bomb. The Americans knew immediately what this meant. The Manhattan Project had succeeded, the atomic bomb was real, and it was being deployed against Japan. Bob felt sick. He had participated in firebombing cities, killing civilians by the thousands. Those missions haunted him, but at least firebombing seemed comprehensible. Thousands of planes, millions of bombs, hours of sustained attack. Cause and effect were proportional. But one bomb destroying an entire city, killing 100,000 people in 1 microsecond. The scale was incomprehensible, beyond human understanding. This was apocalyptic power, delivered by a single aircraft. August 9th, Nagasaki. Another atomic bomb. Another city erased, another 40,000 dead in an instant. The village seemed stunned. People walked through streets like ghosts, faces blank, unable to process what had occurred. Some cried openly, some prayed at the small Shinto shrine in the village center, some simply sat in doorways, staring at nothing. Japan was finished. Everyone understood this. You couldn't fight against weapons that destroyed cities in seconds. You couldn't win against an enemy with godlike destructive power. Continuing the war was suicide. August 15, 1945. At noon, every radio in the village was turned on. Every civilian gathered in groups, listening. Emperor Hirohito himself was about to speak to the Japanese people for the first time in history. The emperor was considered divine, too sacred to perform mundane acts like radio broadcasts. His intervention meant something momentous was occurring. Hirohito's voice was thin, high-pitched, speaking in archaic formal Japanese that most civilians struggled to fully understand. But his message was clear enough. The war was ending. Japan was surrendering. Unconditional surrender. The empire had fallen. Some villagers wept, some seemed relieved, some looked angry, humiliated by defeat. The old traditional Japan, the Japan that had existed for 1,000 years, was dying. A new Japan would emerge from the ashes, shaped by American occupation, transformed into something unrecognizable. Tanaka came to the prisoner's house that evening. He looked exhausted, aged another decade in a single day. He spoke quietly through the lieutenant. The Americans were free. Within days, American forces would arrive to formally occupy Japan. The prisoners would be returned to their military, would go home to their families. The war was over. Bob stood and walked to Tanaka. For a long moment, the two men looked at each other. No words were adequate. How do you thank someone for saving your life? How do you express gratitude for mercy when vengeance was deserved? Bob did the only thing that felt right. He embraced the old man. Tanaka stiffened at first. Physical contact between men was unusual in traditional Japanese culture. But then he relaxed and returned the embrace. Two men from opposite sides of a brutal war, holding each other, sharing mutual respect and grief. When they separated, both men had tears in their eyes. August 20th, 1945. American forces entered Minamata. Jeeps and trucks rolling through streets, soldiers waving American flags, some villagers watching silently, others retreating into their homes. For Bob and his crew, the sight of American uniforms was surreal. 5 weeks ago, they had been bombing Japan. Now American soldiers walked through Japanese villages as conquerors, taking control of a defeated nation. An intelligence officer interviewed each crew member separately, documenting their shoot-down, their survival, their treatment as prisoners. The officer seemed skeptical when Bob described Tanaka's intervention. Japanese civilians didn't save American airmen, they killed them. Every intelligence report confirmed this pattern, but Bob insisted the story was true. Tanaka had saved them, not just from execution, but had ensured they were well treated, adequately fed, given medical care, protected them from villagers who wanted revenge. The officer noted this in his report, but seemed doubtful it would be believed by higher command. The crew was evacuated by truck to Nagasaki, then by ship to Okinawa, then by air to Saipan, retracing their journey to war in reverse. At each stop, they received medical evaluation, debriefing, preparation for return to the United States. At Saipan, Bob asked permission to send a letter to Tanaka, requested an address. The officer handling his case looked at him with confusion. Sending letters to Japanese civilians was highly irregular. Probably wouldn't be delivered anyway. The Japanese postal system was in chaos, but Bob insisted, wrote the letter. Addressed it to village elder Tanaka Hiroshi, Minamata, Kumamoto Prefecture, Kyushu, Japan. The letter was simple. Bob thanked Tanaka for his mercy, expressed gratitude for his life, promised to remember Tanaka's lesson about humanity transcending hatred, hoped that Tanaka lived a long, peaceful life, honored by his community. Bob handed the letter to the postal officer and hoped it might somehow reach its destination. Then he boarded the ship that would carry him across the Pacific. Toward home, toward Mary, toward a life after war. September 15th, 1945, the train pulled into Kenosha Station at 3:00 p.m., engine hissing steam, brakes squealing, carrying several dozen returning servicemen toward reunions with families they hadn't seen in months or years. Bob stood at the door, duffel bag in hand, watching the platform come into view through the window. Hundreds of people waited, families holding signs, children waving flags, everyone scanning the emerging soldiers, searching for their specific loved one. He stepped onto the platform. The afternoon sun felt warm after the train's air-conditioned interior. He searched the crowd and saw her. Mary stood at the far end of the platform, white dress, brown hair curled in the style of the era. One hand holding a small bouquet of flowers, the other pressed to her mouth. She had received the telegram in late July. Missing in action. Presumed captured. No additional information available. For 7 weeks, she hadn't known if Bob was alive or dead. 3 days ago, a second telegram arrived. Prisoner recovered. Alive, uninjured. Returning home, Bob ran, dropped his duffel bag, pushed through the crowd, reached Mary and swept her into his arms, lifting her off the ground, spinning her, holding her so tightly she gasped. She was crying. He was crying. Neither could speak through the tears and overwhelming emotion. They just held each other, two people who had survived separation and uncertainty, reunited against odds they had both doubted. Finally, Mary managed to speak. She told him she had thought he was dead, that she had prepared herself for a funeral, for mourning, for life as a war widow at age 23. That hope had become an enemy, making the waiting more painful. Bob apologized, said sorry over and over, though rationally he knew he had nothing to apologize for. Sorry for leaving. Sorry for the fear she experienced. Sorry for not coming home sooner. Just sorry. They stood on the platform holding each other for 15 minutes. Around them, other reunions occurred. Other soldiers embraced families. Other women cried in relief. The platform was full of joy and tears and gratitude. Eventually, Bob's parents arrived. His mother saw him and broke into sobs. His father stood rigid, jaw clenched, eyes bright with unshed tears. Thomas Hanson had survived World War I, had waited 2 years wondering if his only son would survive World War II. Now Bob stood before him, alive, whole, home. They drove to the Hanson house on Maple Street. The house was exactly as Bob remembered. Same green shutters, same front porch, same trees in the yard, as if the war had never happened, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Bob had changed. He had seen things no 24-year-old should see, done things no person should have to do, survived experiences that would mark him permanently. That night, his mother prepared his favorite meal: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, apple pie. The same Sunday dinner they had been eating when news of Pearl Harbor interrupted their peaceful afternoon 4 years earlier. The circle was complete. War had ended. Bob had survived. Life could resume, except Bob knew it couldn't. Not really. You couldn't go back to innocence once you had seen war. Couldn't pretend the world was simple and safe. Couldn't unknow what you had learned about human capacity for both cruelty and unexpected compassion. Bob and Mary married on November 10, 1945, 2 months after his return. They didn't want to wait. War had taught them both that time was precious, that futures weren't guaranteed, that delaying happiness was foolish. The ceremony was held at St. Mary's Lutheran Church with 200 guests, family, friends. Some of Bob's crew attended: Jimmy, David, Frank, Rocky. The men who had survived the war together, celebrating the peace together. During his toast, Jimmy joked that Bob had saved his life twice, once by shoving him out of a burning aircraft, once by introducing him to whiskey. The guests laughed, though those who knew the full story understood the darker implications behind the humor. Bob and Mary honeymooned in Chicago for a week, then returned to Kenosha and began building their life together. Bob enrolled at the University of Wisconsin using his GI Bill benefits, majoring in civil engineering as he had planned before the war. Mary got a job as a secretary at the Johnson Motors plant, where Bob's father worked. Over the next 10 years, they had 4 children: Robert Jr. in 1947, Elizabeth in 1949, Thomas in 1951, Sarah in 1953. Bob graduated with his engineering degree in 1950 and found work with a Milwaukee firm designing bridges and commercial buildings. On the surface, Bob's life looked completely normal. Standard American success story: veteran returns home, gets degree, marries sweetheart, has children, establishes career. The American dream realized. But Bob carried the war inside him. He had nightmares about burning cities, sometimes woke screaming, Mary shaking him, pulling him back from whatever hell his unconscious was revisiting. He couldn't watch war movies, couldn't enjoy 4th of July fireworks. The explosions triggered something visceral. Avoided airports because aircraft engines made his hands shake. He never flew again. Not once in 58 years after returning from the war. Refused business trips requiring flights, drove everywhere even when flying would have been far more efficient. Mary asked him once why he wouldn't fly. He told her that he had used up all his luck in the war. That aircraft had tried to kill him repeatedly, and he had barely survived. That continuing to tempt fate by flying seemed arrogant and foolish. She didn't press the issue. In December 1945, Bob wrote a letter to Tanaka Hiroshi. Didn't know if it would arrive. The Japanese postal system was in chaos. Mail was often lost or destroyed. But Bob needed to try. He wrote about his safe return home, his marriage, his gratitude for Tanaka's mercy. He said he thought about the old man often, remembered his lesson about humanity transcending hatred. Promised to honor Tanaka's wisdom in how he lived his life. Bob sent the letter through military postal channels and hoped. 4 months later, in April 1946, a reply arrived. The envelope was battered, stained, heavily stamped with postal markings from multiple facilities. But it had somehow navigated the broken Japanese infrastructure and crossed the Pacific. The letter inside was written in broken English, clearly composed with great difficulty and probably significant assistance from someone with better language skills. Tanaka expressed happiness that Bob had survived. Returned home, found peace, said he thought of Bob sometimes, wondered if the young American pilot remembered an old Japanese farmer who made an unusual choice, hoped Bob would live long, love deeply, and find meaning in his survival. The letter concluded with a simple request: live well, be happy. That would be sufficient thanks. Bob cried reading the letter. showed it to Mary, carefully preserved it in a folder that would eventually contain decades of correspondence. For the next 30 years, Bob and Tanaka exchanged letters twice a year. Bob wrote about his children's births, his career developments, his gradual healing from war trauma. Tanaka wrote about his rice farm, village events, the changing post-war Japan. The letters were never particularly deep or philosophical, just two men maintaining connection across an ocean, across cultures, across the history that should have made them eternal enemies. Then, in 1975, a different kind of letter arrived. Tanaka Kenji, grandson of Tanaka Hiroshi, wrote to inform Bob that his grandfather had died peacefully in his sleep at age 95. The entire village had attended his funeral. He had been honored and respected until his final day. Before dying, Tanaka had asked his grandson to convey a message to the American pilot he had saved. He wanted Bob to know he never regretted his decision, that choosing mercy over revenge had brought him more peace than vengeance could have provided, that Bob's survival and happy life validated his choice. The letter ended with an invitation. The village was erecting a monument in Tanaka's honor. Bob was invited to attend the dedication ceremony. Bob wept for 3 days after receiving that letter. He had lost a friend he had never truly known. A man whose single act of mercy had given Bob his entire life, marriage, children, career, everything. Everything Bob valued existed because Tanaka had chosen compassion in war's darkest moment, July 1985. Bob was 64 years old, long retired from engineering, living comfortably on his pension and Social Security. He had debated whether to accept Kenji's invitation. Returning to Japan meant confronting memories he had spent 40 years trying to bury. But Mary convinced him. She said he owed Tanaka this, owed him presence at his memorial, owed him acknowledgement of what he had done. So Bob and Mary boarded a flight to Japan. Bob's first time in an aircraft since August 1945. The takeoff terrified him. His hands gripped the armrests white-knuckled. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, fighting panic. But the flight was uneventful, 12 hours from Chicago to Tokyo, then a short domestic flight to Kumamoto, then a bus ride to Minamata. The village had changed dramatically. Small houses had been replaced by modern structures. Paved roads replaced dirt paths. Cars and bicycles filled streets that had been empty in 1945. Economic growth had transformed rural Japan. But the central square remained recognizable. The same basic layout, some of the same older buildings. Bob stood in that square and remembered kneeling in the dirt, waiting for a sword to end his life. Kenji met him there, now middle-aged himself, around 50, wearing a business suit, speaking fluent English learned in post-war schools. The monument stood in the square's center, a granite stone, 10 feet tall, with inscriptions in Japanese and English. In memory of Tanaka Hiroshi, who chose mercy over vengeance, who taught that enemies can become friends, who proved that humanity survives even in war, and in honor of Captain Robert Hanson, who lived the life that mercy gave him, who never forgot an old man's wisdom, who showed that gratitude transcends time. Bob stood before the stone for a long time, read and reread the inscription, thought about the 40 years since 1945, the 4 children he had raised, the bridges he had designed, the life he had lived, all because an old man chose mercy. The village gathered for the dedication ceremony, several hundred people. Most were too young to remember the war, but they knew the story. Tanaka Hiroshi was a village legend, the elder who had saved American prisoners when conventional wisdom demanded their execution. Bob spoke briefly at the ceremony. He thanked Tanaka posthumously, described how Tanaka's mercy had given him his entire life, said he hoped people would remember this story, would understand that even in war's darkest hours, even between bitterest enemies, compassion was possible. When he finished speaking, the crowd applauded. Not for him. For Tanaka. For the memory of a man who proved that hatred didn't have to be permanent, that enemies could recognize shared humanity. That evening, Kenji took Bob and Mary to Tanaka's grave. A simple stone in the village cemetery, fresh flowers lay at its base, indicating regular visitors. Bob knelt and placed his own flowers, whispered thank you, said goodbye to a friend he had only briefly known, but who had shaped his entire existence. Bob lived until 2003. He was 82 when cancer finally claimed him. In his final weeks, lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by family, Mary, his 4 children, 8 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren, he talked about his life, the good parts, the happy memories. But mostly he talked about Tanaka, about an old Japanese farmer who taught him the most important lesson anyone ever taught him. That war makes enemies of people who might otherwise be friends. That hatred is a choice, not an inevitability. That mercy is always possible, even when vengeance seems justified. Bob told his family to remember Tanaka's lesson, to see humanity in people who seem different or threatening, to choose compassion when anger seems easier, to break cycles of hatred rather than perpetuating them. His daughter Sarah asked if he had forgiven the Japanese for Pearl Harbor, for starting the war that nearly killed him. Bob smiled weakly. He said forgiveness became necessary the moment Tanaka lowered that execution sword. How could Bob hold on to hatred after experiencing such mercy? How could he remain enemies with people when one of them had saved his life? Tanaka taught him that Japanese people weren't monsters. They were people, just people, caught in the same historical forces as Americans, doing what they believed was right, just as Americans believed they were right. War forced them to be enemies. Peace allowed them to be human again. On August 15, 2003, exactly 58 years after Japan's surrender, Bob died peacefully in his sleep. Mary was holding his hand. His funeral was attended by 300 people, family, friends, fellow veterans, colleagues from his engineering career. One guest came from Japan. Tanaka Kenji, now 68 years old, traveled to Wisconsin specifically to attend Bob's funeral. He laid flowers on the casket and spoke briefly about his grandfather's legacy. He said Bob's long, happy life validated Tanaka Hiroshi's decision, proved that mercy could triumph over vengeance, demonstrated that choosing compassion, even in war's darkest hour, created ripples that extended for generations. Bob's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all existed because Tanaka chose mercy. An entire family tree, dozens of lives, all branching from that single moment in 1945 when an old man lowered a sword. Kenji concluded his remarks with his grandfather's final words. Life is more precious than revenge. Love is stronger than hatred. Choose compassion, always. The funeral ended. Bob was buried in Kenosha, in the same cemetery where his parents rested. His gravestone was simple. Robert James Hanson, 1921-2003. Beloved husband, father, grandfather. He was shown mercy and lived with gratitude. This story is not fiction. Similar events occurred during World War II with surprising frequency. Japanese civilians who protected American pilots, German soldiers who helped Jewish families escape, Soviet officers who released German prisoners, enemies who recognized shared humanity even in war's depths. War reveals both humanity's worst and best qualities. It shows our capacity for cruelty, hatred, violence, but it also shows our capacity for mercy, compassion, and transcendence. Robert Hanson and Tanaka Hiroshi represent this duality. Both participated in a brutal war. Both had reasons to hate. Both faced choices about whether to perpetuate violence or break its cycle. Tanaka chose mercy. And that choice rippled forward through time, creating a life that wouldn't have otherwise existed, touching people who would never know the full story of why they existed. This is war's secret truth. For every story of atrocity and horror, another story of unexpected humanity exists. For every act of cruelty, an act of compassion occurs. For every person consumed by hatred, another person chooses understanding. We remember the cruelty better. It's more dramatic, more shocking, easier to fit into simple narratives about good and evil. But the compassion matters more. It represents our better nature, our capacity to remain human even when circumstances push us toward becoming monsters. Today, conflicts still rage across the world. Hatreds persist, divisions deepen. People reduce complex humans to simple categories of friend and enemy, us and them, good and evil. But Tanaka's lesson remains relevant. Our enemies are still people, still humans with families, hopes, fears, love. War forces us into conflict with them. But war doesn't change fundamental reality. We're all human, under uniforms and flags and ideologies and national identities. We all want similar things: safety, security, love, purpose, happiness. War tries to make us forget this shared humanity, tries to convince us that enemies are fundamentally different, less deserving of mercy, appropriate targets for unlimited violence. Tanaka refused that logic. He saw a young American pilot and recognized his own son, saw Bob's humanity despite the uniform, chose mercy despite having every justification for revenge. That choice didn't end the war, didn't change history, didn't prevent Hiroshima or Nagasaki or the thousands of deaths that followed. One old man's compassion couldn't override global conflict, but it saved 11 lives, created ripples that extended through generations, proved that mercy was possible even in impossible circumstances. Remember this story. Tell it to others. Share Tanaka's lesson, because we need that lesson today as much as 1945 needed it, maybe more. Peace is possible, but only if we choose it, only if we refuse to let hatred consume us, only if we recognize humanity in people who seem different or threatening or enemy. Tanaka and Bob proved this truth 80 years ago in a small Japanese village. Their story remains relevant because human nature hasn't changed. We still face the same choice: mercy or vengeance, compassion or hatred, humanity or dehumanization. Choose wisely. Choose compassion. Always.